Okay, so our final industry presentation is situated within the higher education context. So a number of our current team were involved in an SLRC project a few years ago that resulted in the development of the Higher Education Learning Framework, a set of 7 evidence-informed principles for learning, teaching and assessment in higher education. So this year, Jason, Steph, Alex and Anne-Marie have been building on this work and are undertaking a project to develop a similar set of principles, but this time relating to online learning in higher education, which I think we can all agree is a very pertinent field for everyone at the moment. So Associate Professor Jason Lodge is here to present to you today what the project is about. So Jason's research actually concentrates on the application of learning sciences to higher education, and specifically he's interested in the cognitive and emotional factors that influence learning and behaviour, and how research findings from the learning sciences can be better used to enhance the design of learning, teaching practice and education policy. So can we please welcome Associate Professor Jason Lodge.
Thanks, Sasha. Thanks, everybody. I will warn you in advance, I'm going to be nowhere near as polished as Chase, but we'll see what we can do. I am also going to be provocative. We're getting towards the end of the day. I feel like that might be something that might be beneficial for us. This is an interesting project in that our industry partner is ourselves. It's all very weird, but I teach teachers how to teach teachers, so that's okay. So I will recognise that Alex has done a lot of the work on this, a lot of the heavy lifting on the actual kind of data collection side of things, and Steph and Anne-Marie have been heavily involved in this process as well. So what is going on with learning and technology in 2022? We've heard some really great examples of how technology can be integrated. So I'm thinking about State High here, and I'm thinking about Canterbury. We've heard about some examples of some of these things being done well. Is that always the case? I'm going to suggest that perhaps it isn't. Arguments that I've heard in the last few weeks. Students are just going to learn via TikTok. So we should make them 30-second videos. That's all we should do. We don't need to worry about supporting students. We'll get an AI chatbot to do it for us. Does this sound great? Or does this sound deeply worrying? And I think particularly for us in higher ed, for a lot of reasons, because there's panic about the spaces that we're in right now being completely empty when people are having classes. We have these kinds of ultimate saviours coming out to help us from certain tech companies. You know, they put forward these heroes and these gurus that tell us that all we need is to have Microsoft Teams and it's going to solve every single one of our problems that we might ever have in history. Now, that's not to say that Microsoft Teams can't be used well. Again, we've heard an example today of that being the case. Clearly a bit of a problem to think that we can just take one tool off the shelf and it's going to solve the fact that lecture theatres are empty now. No. However, we know that technology has moved, right? And we are seeing the sorts of setups, including what we have here today, where we are doing this in dual mode. If you think back only 5 years ago, this wouldn't have been possible, right? We wouldn't have even thought that it would have been possible, yet here we are today, and it's not quite seamless, but almost seamless. And I say not quite because while we're developing these new great technologies and approaches that allow things to happen in hybrid, it's also weird, right? And you don't need to go very far to see thousands of memes like this that suggest that we're in an interesting moment in terms of the way that we're interacting digitally, right? There's some weird stuff going on. There's even weirder stuff, but we're in polite company here. We're not going to go. You all know what's happened out there. People being caught doing all sorts of things. What's going on here? Right, what is going on here? What can we understand about this process? For those of us who have been working in educational technology, so I'm educational psychology, educational technologies, adult learning, kind of in the middle of all of that. It's a little bit frustrating because for the last couple of years, we've been hearing, oh, online learning, brand new, you know, blah, blah, blah. No. All right. For those of us who have been around long enough, School of the Air, all right, this was learning that was happening at a distance at different times in different places. The packs of stuff that used to come out in the post, all right? Anybody remember those stories? You'd learn it, it'd all come out in Australia Post, right? So some of what we're talking about here is a little bit different to before, particularly the Zoom side of things or Microsoft Teams, but a lot of the kind of fundamentals are things that we've been playing with for a long time, 25 years or more if we're talking about online in particular. So it's this kind of idea of a historical amnesia of EdTech. We've got 25 years or more now of really good research, including stuff that's based on the science of learning that tells us about what's going on here and what we can do about this and how to do it well. When technologies are introduced, there is a very kind of consistent pattern that seems to emerge. So much so that Gartner Inc., and some of you might be familiar with this, are able to plot them on a path. And every year they bring one of these out and they put where all the technologies are over time. Interactive whiteboards. Anybody been around long enough for that? They're right down here somewhere, right? Over here, we've got artificial intelligence of various kinds. We've got Zuckerberg's metaverse weedy thing that he's going on about now. And they tend to follow this fairly reliable path. I'm the wet blanket that takes it from the very top there right down to the bottom here, right? It takes a while for us to do the research to say, okay, hold on. We've got a lot of hype around this thing. What do we really understand about what's working here, right? And why it's working and what we can do with it and how we can use it effectively over time. And it's great to hear an example of this today, iPads, right? Remember a few years ago, it was like they were going to revolutionize everything and it was going to be the greatest thing ever and we were going to have iPads everywhere. And we've reached the point now where they actually are really helpful. And again, we've heard an example of this today. We found this plateau of productivity. So that's one example of a technology that has gone through this cycle. One thing that we're always up against is that whenever we move into an online environment in particular, as humans, we much prefer this. This is what we're familiar with. Sorry for the people who are online. I'm not assuming doing this. We have this compulsion of proximity, and it's no different when we're learning, right? There is something about being in the same environment, our ability to read body language. We communicate in a very complex way, and there is a whole lot of information that is being transferred back and forward when we're in the same place at the same time. That doesn't translate the same way when we move online. Right? We don't have the same amount of information. It's different, right? And we're always going to be up against that. Because of that complexity, and this is an editorial for the journal that I'm on that we wrote recently, there is a lot of nonsense out there, right? And it's a particular problem in higher education for a number of reasons, because again, there is pressure on us with these spaces. We've got a lot of flexibility that we can offer and so on. The gap that we have between what we currently understand and where we seem to be headed is kind of filled with all this weird stuff. You know, still discussions about things like digital natives and learning styles that we kind of debunked a decade ago. So it's an interesting problem that we're kind of dealing with. So we really wanted to get this down to a kind of ground truth, and this is where the higher education learning framework comes in. Now, some of this might seem fairly self-evident, but we're constantly going against this tide of people who are self-promoters and gurus and technology companies and all these people out there who are out to make all of this money by providing a simple solution to what is a really complex problem. Right? Learning is complex, it's difficult. If you've got 1,000 students in a first-year biology course, that's really complicated. How do you personalize something for 1,000 students based on, you know, their life of experience? It's a complex problem. People are filling the gap with nonsense. So we wanted to really think about what is it that matters most. That's what the original higher education learning framework really was trying to address. And as part of the original work, we talked to 24 people who we identified as being the world's leading experts in the science of learning and as it applies to higher education. Right? And on the basis of those interviews, we distilled that down into 7 principles that kind of pick up on a lot of the stuff we've heard today. Right? So I don't think there's really a lot of surprises in that, but what it does allow us to do is talk to our colleagues here to be able to say, we've got something that is based on some empirical evidence from the experts who have been doing this for a long time, internationally recognised. They're telling us that these are the things that we need to focus on. Right? And I've got a link there to the SLR website. There's a link on the front page if you want to have a copy of this. What we tried to do is not just put a set of principles in there, but to then also say, what does this mean for students? What does this mean for learning activities? What does this mean for assessment and so on? So it's not a prescription. The idea is to say, here's a set of principles. Here are some ways of thinking about how those principles might play out. All right? It's clear that we need to revisit this now. A little thing happened a couple of years ago that you might have all heard about. There was a lot of online learning. What does this mean in this new normal that we currently seem to be in? Now, we're still working on that. We have some data. We've conducted some interviews very similar to what we did before, talking to people who have expertise in online learning and what it means in higher education. We're going to distill all of that and make sense of the things that we should focus on. Other people have been attacking this as well. We've thankfully reached the point in this process where we're no longer saying, oh my God, what's going on here? I'm going to interview my 10 students and they're going to tell me how terrible everything is. We're now seeing some much more systematic approaches to trying to make sense of what's happened over the last few years, right? Particularly in terms of online learning. This is one really good example of this, and they've essentially pointed to, this is more from our perspective as teachers. So this is a bit more about the things that are important for student learning. This is a little bit more about what do we do? And this is ultimately where we're trying to head with this version 2.0 of this. And again, things that we've heard about today, right? But it's again, nice to have that reminder in a very systematic way. These are the things that are important. Now, if a technology company comes out to the university now and says, you should buy our tool for $25 million, how is it actually helping us do any of these things? Where is the evidence that it's going to help us do these things? And how is it going to impact on the things that we identify as being important for student learning? It gives us that ground truth that we can go back to, because there is so much discussion at the moment about where we're headed and which tool and whether we should be doing things online or on campus. Or tell us about what it means in terms of these, right? So it's a very useful foundation that we found. It's also something, this version is also something that is deeply embedded in the way that we work with our teachers across the university. So as teachers start teaching in this environment, because they don't get, a 3-year degree like every other formal educational environment, they need something to actually start them off so that they can understand how students learn. For us, it's this. It's being used at the University of Melbourne, the University of Sydney, USQ, a few other places. So again, it works in a number of different ways to provide a foundation for what we do around here. And this is starting to inform our online learning strategy as a predominantly campus-based institution. This is all a little bit new for us. So again, it's great to have this touchstone to go back to say, how is what we're doing helping to facilitate these things? Right? How does that actually play out? So what are the mechanics of this? And one of the other things that our initial experts told us is that what is critical in the process of thinking about the science of learning and what we understand about how learning works for translating that to practice is a very explicit sort of design process. Design isn't always going to be as linear as that. There's a bit of back and forward that goes on, of course, but it gets us to think about multiple places where we can take the science of learning and say, can we help define the problem that we're seeing here? My students are not turning up to lectures. My students are not turning up to training sessions. What's going on? Can we try and find a way of understanding what's happening there? If we want to implement some sort of new solution, technology-based or otherwise, can we go back to the science of learning and figure out what it is that we might expect if we were to implement that new tool or technology? So there are multiple places where we can start to have those conversations. But again, as you've heard multiple times today, this is about partnership, right? So for me, as somebody who works in this environment, I might know something about teaching psychology and education. I have no idea what it's like to teach architecture. Right? I don't know what it's like to teach law. Right? And same goes for other university contexts. I don't understand those contexts. We have that conversation. We have this ground truth to work from, and we can then start to think about how we can implement that in a context-specific way. So that will give you a bit of a flavour of where we're going with this higher education learning framework. And that's me. If you'd like to follow up, that's my email. I used to put my Twitter handle up there, but given what's going on Twitter at the moment, I'm not so sure about that.
Thanks, Jason. Does anyone have any questions? Oh, I can see one already.
Yeah, I had to sit all the way up the back.
So Jason, I'm interested about another thing that you haven't touched on there. You talked about ground truths, but it seems like there's missing is large trials. I mean, asking experts is one thing, but imagine if you said to treat a medical condition, we asked 25 experts, as opposed to we then developed hypotheses and ran a large trial to investigate the efficacy of those interventions.
I didn't mention that bit. So the other thing that contributed to this, because it's a good point, Paul, the other thing that contributed to the initial version is that we did draw quite heavily on the literature, a lot of which has those particular trials. One additional advantage we've got in terms of a digital version is that a lot of the kinds of trials that we might carry out were done as part of the massive open online course things that happened about a decade ago. Now, those involved, in some cases, hundreds of thousands of students. So there was an enormous amount of A/B testing of various things within those environments. And that has been, really rich data that will inform this. But it's a great point, Paul. When we wanted to make sure that we tried to capture a bit of both of that in the original HELF, and we'll do the same thing here. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Liz. I've just got I'm wondering about the difference between pedagogy and adult learning. So in the space you're in here, you have students of all ages, but primarily lots of kids that have finished school and aren't quite, fully fledged adults yet. How does that influence the framework?
It's a really good question. Now, having had students before who were people who already had PhDs and were of that age, I can tell you I heard just as many excuses about the dog eating my homework. I had tantrums. So I'm not entirely convinced by the idea of kind of andragogy sorts of things, because when we see students come to university, we can often see similar issues around kind of self-regulation and those sorts of things. They're not going to act like a 6-year-old. Obviously, it's a gradation thing, but the fundamental issues are kind of the same. They just play out in a different sort of way. That's the assumption that we're largely working with you. So we've got this, what they call an ice cream can and a cone model, where, for young children, the self-regulation part is mostly externally imposed on them, but that's a continuum that goes along. And when it comes to learning, we can certainly have postgrad students who still have difficulty with that self-regulation of learning that we need to help them through with. So the issues are very similar. They just kind of play out in slightly different ways. And that's sort of the assumption that we take to this. Does that help? Yep.
Hi, I'm just wondering to what extent you can attach methods to these pillars, because I look at the pillars and they're great, but I'm thinking feedback. I think feedback is a very important method, and I'm just wondering if you can tease out those two methods.
In the longer version of this, I talk about this separation between teaching philosophy, overall pedagogical approach, and strategies and tactics. And we can think about how the sorts of things that I've talked about play across for all of those levels. So the way that we think about it at the university is that we take these as our kind of overall, what we call pedagogical philosophy. Here's our understanding about how students learn, right? Next level down becomes, here are the overall approaches that we're identifying are important. Then those should line up. The next level down is, what are the strategies that I'm going to use, including things like feedback, a Zoom session, whatever the case may be. How do I then figure out what that looks like in a lesson plan? Then the step below that, these should all line up. The step below that is the tactics. I'm going to do a Zoom session. What are the things that I need to have in place in order to execute that Zoom session well? So yeah, that is kind of the next layer down. I only had 10 minutes, couldn't go into all of that, but I just did that. Thank you for the question. It was a good one.
Any other questions? No. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jason. Excellent. So I hope that you really enjoyed listening to the diverse and emerging industry partnerships that are going on. And I think it's very clear that learning is lifelong and it transcends many different facets, not just in school settings, but beyond. And I guess in schools, we're preparing, individuals for life after the school gates. And I think we can see it's a continual trend here.